The grief was a physical weight, a shroud of lead that Alani wore every waking moment. It had been 6 months since David was gone, 6 months since the world had fractured into a before and an after. The before was light and laughter, the smell of his cologne on the pillow, the easy rhythm of their life together in their small apartment that felt like a kingdom. The after was this: the oppressive silence, the mountain of unexpected debt, and the acrid scent of industrial-grade cleaner that clung to her clothes and skin. She had taken the job with the elite cleaning service 2 months ago, out of desperation. The pay was a lifeline, the only thing keeping her head above the rising tide of final notices and threats of eviction. They had assigned her to a single, exclusive client, a sprawling, minimalist mansion on the cliffs overlooking the city, a fortress of glass and white stone that seemed to scorn the messy, vibrant world below. The owner was a man she had only glimpsed, Mr. Saito, a figure of quiet, unnerving stillness who moved through the cavernous halls like a ghost in his own home. Her work was a mindless, repetitive solace, polishing floors until they reflected the cold, gray sky, wiping down surfaces so sterile they held no trace of human touch. She was as invisible as the dust motes she chased away, a silent cog in the machinery of a life utterly alien to her own. The mansion was a museum of wealth, cold and impersonal. There were no family photos on the gleaming white walls, no cluttered shelves, no sign of the chaotic, beautiful mess of a life lived. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort. And in its perfect, silent emptiness, Alani's grief had room to breathe, to expand until it filled every corner of her heart. She often felt like she was scrubbing away parts of herself, erasing the woman who had laughed with David, the woman who had dreams beyond the next paycheck. This job, this house, this was her penance for surviving when he had not. Every day was a pilgrimage into that sterile silence, a place where her own sorrow felt fitting, where the stark architecture mirrored the hollowed-out landscape of her soul. This was the routine, the new and brutal rhythm of her life, and she believed, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that this was all it would ever be. Mr. Kaito Saito was less a man and more a presence, an atmospheric pressure change that signaled his arrival in a room. Alani learned the signs, the subtle shift in the posture of the 2 guards who stood like statues by the front entrance, the almost imperceptible scent of expensive sandalwood and tea, the way the profound silence of the mansion somehow deepened, becoming heavier, more deliberate. In the 8 weeks she had worked there, she had seen him perhaps a dozen times, always from a distance. He was a man in his 40s, with a severe, handsome face and eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. His movements were precise, economical, devoid of any wasted gesture. He wore dark, impeccably tailored suits that made him look more like a CEO of a global corporation than what the hushed rumors among the other service staff suggested he was: a powerful, feared leader in the Yakuza. The word itself, whispered in the delivery bay, felt like a violation of the house's pristine quiet. Alani tried to ignore it, to focus on the grime on the baseboards and the streaks on the glass. What Mr. Saito was, what he did beyond these white walls, was not her concern. Her concern was the rent, the electricity bill, the lingering medical expenses that David's paltry insurance had barely touched. Yet, she couldn't help but feel the stark, brutal contrast between their worlds. He glided through halls she scrubbed on her hands and knees. He drank from crystal glasses she polished until her fingers ached. He was the king in his silent castle, and she was the lowest of his serfs, a ghost who cleaned up after other ghosts. He never spoke to her. He never even looked at her. His gaze would slide over her dark blue uniform, her cart of supplies, as if she were just another piece of furniture, a functional object devoid of thought or feeling. This invisibility was both a shield and a wound. It protected her from the fear his reputation inspired, but it also reinforced the gnawing loneliness that had become her constant companion. She was no one, a pair of hands, a function. In the vast, cold expanse of Mr. Sato's world, a woman like Alani, with her broken heart and her worn-out shoes, simply did not exist. The anomaly occurred on a Tuesday. Her supervisor, a stern woman who communicated mostly through clipped text messages, had informed her of a change in her duties. She was now to include the West Wing study on her weekly rotation, a room that had previously been off-limits. The door, usually locked, was ajar when she arrived with her cart, a silent invitation into a part of the mansion she had never seen. The study was different from the rest of the house. While still minimalist, it felt more personal. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines written in Japanese characters she couldn't read. A large, formidable desk of polished black stone sat before a floor-to-ceiling window that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the ocean. It was a room of power, of quiet contemplation. Her eyes scanned the walls as she began to dust, moving methodically. And then she saw it. Tucked away on a side wall, nestled between a framed piece of calligraphy and a landscape painting of a misty mountain, was a small collection of photographs in simple, elegant silver frames. There were 4 of them. 3 were of an elderly Japanese couple and a young boy with a solemn face. The 4th photograph made the air leave Alani's lungs in a single, silent gasp. Her heart stopped, then restarted with a painful, violent lurch. It was David. Not a formal portrait, but a candid shot, one she had never seen before. He was leaning against a brick wall, sunlight catching the side of his face, a wide, genuine smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He was wearing his favorite faded denim jacket, the one he'd had since college. It was him. It was the man she loved, the man she had buried, his vibrant, living essence captured in a silver frame, hanging on the wall of a cold-blooded stranger. The dust cloth slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor. She took a stumbling step closer, her hand rising to her mouth to stifle a cry. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't someone who just looked like him. It was David's smile, his scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, the specific way his hair curled at the temples. Every detail was a fresh stab of grief, but it was a grief sharpened by a terrifying, impossible confusion.
Why? How?
The question hammered against the inside of her skull, a frantic, desperate drumbeat. Why was her husband's photo in this house? For 3 days, the image of the photograph was burned onto the back of her eyelids. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw David's smile, hanging on that wall. The question of how it got there became an obsession, a fever in her blood that burned away the dull ache of her grief and replaced it with a sharp, insistent panic. What was the connection between her kind, gentle David, a man who worked at a community center, who spent his weekends volunteering at the animal shelter, and Kaito Saito, a man who commanded fear with his silence? The 2 realities could not coexist. Her mind spun, inventing 100 terrible scenarios. Had David been in debt to this man? Had he been involved in something dangerous, something he had hidden from her? No. She recoiled from the thought. It wasn't possible. It wasn't the man she knew. But the photograph was proof of something, a link she could not comprehend. When she returned to the West Wing the following week, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and resolve, she found the study door locked. A cold wave of disappointment and fear washed over her. Had she been seen? Did he know she had discovered the secret? The thought made her skin crawl. She felt watched, exposed. The mansion no longer felt like a place of quiet solitude. It felt like a trap. Her invisibility, once a comfort, was now a source of terror. She had to know the truth. The need for it was a primal, desperate hunger. Her love for David, the fierce, protective core of it that had survived his death, demanded an answer. Fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. She began to watch Mr. Saito, her movements still quiet and efficient, but her eyes now sharp, searching. She tracked his routine, the times he was in the study, the moments he was alone. Finally, on a Thursday evening, she saw her chance. He was at his desk, the door slightly ajar, the warm light from his lamp spilling into the dim hallway. She left her cart behind, a silent testament to her abandoned duties. Her hands were trembling, her breath catching in her throat, but she forced her feet to move. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, the soft click of the latch behind her sounding as final as a gunshot. He looked up from the papers on his desk, his eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. There was no surprise in his expression, only a cold, assessing stillness. He didn't seem to see a grieving widow. He saw an interruption, a breach of protocol. For a moment, Alani's courage faltered. The immense, dangerous power of the man was a palpable force in the room, pressing down on her. She felt small, foolish, an insect about to be crushed. She swallowed hard, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. She had to speak before her nerve broke completely. Her voice, when it came, was a reedy whisper, barely audible but slicing through the quiet. "Why is my husband's photo in your mansion?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply watched her, his gaze unwavering, unreadable. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon he wielded with practiced ease. "You are mistaken," he said finally, his voice a low, level baritone with no trace of an accent. "You will leave this room." Now, it was a command, not a request. An order from a man who was not used to being disobeyed. But Alani didn't move. She was anchored to the spot by the sheer force of her need. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, blurring the image of the powerful man before her. "No," she said, her whisper gaining a sliver of strength. "I am not mistaken. That man in the silver frame on your wall, his name was David. He was my husband. He died 6 months ago." She pointed a trembling finger toward the wall, her entire being focused on that one spot. She began to speak of David, the words spilling out of her in a torrent of grief and love. She told him about the way he laughed, about his kindness to stray animals, about his dream of opening a youth center. She painted a portrait of her husband in words, resurrecting him in the sterile, airless room, her voice cracking with the effort. "He was a good man. The best man I have ever known. He had nothing to do with a world like yours. So, I am asking you again, why is he on your wall?" Her raw, unfiltered sorrow was an unexpected assault on the room's composure. She saw a flicker in his eyes, a hairline crack in the marble facade. He slowly turned his head to look at the photograph, then back at her. The mask of indifference was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. Mr. Saito rose from his chair, his movements fluid and deliberate. He walked not to the door, but to the wall of photographs. He stood before them for a long moment, his back to Alani, his shoulders perfectly straight. The tension in the room was suffocating. She expected him to call for his guards, to have her thrown out, to be fired. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the consequences of her impossible bravery. Instead, he spoke, his voice softer now, imbued with a strange, somber resonance. His name was David, he repeated, not as a question, but as a confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth she had laid bare. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something other than cold authority in his eyes. It was a deep, profound weariness, a sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. "I did not know him. Not in the way you did," he began, his gaze dropping to the polished floor. "But he is the reason my son is alive." The words hung in the air, nonsensical and shocking. Alani could only stare, her mind struggling to process the statement. His son? She didn't even know he had a son. "Years ago," Mr. Saito continued, his voice low and steady, "my only child, Hiro, was diagnosed with a severe form of aplastic anemia. His body was failing. The doctors told me his only hope was a bone marrow transplant." He paused, and in that silence, Alani could feel the echo of a father's terror. "I have considerable resources. I spent millions searching for a donor. We tested family, associates, we accessed registries across the globe. But the match had to be perfect. The odds were astronomical." He walked back towards his desk but did not sit. He stood beside it, one hand resting on the cool black stone, as if for support. "After almost a year, when all hope was nearly lost, we found one. A single perfect match, halfway around the world. An anonymous donor on the international registry." He looked directly at Alani, his eyes holding hers with a new, startling intensity. "That man was your husband." The foundation of Alani's world crumbled for the second time in a year. The story Mr. Saito told was of a quiet, unassuming heroism she had never known. David, had received a call from the registry. He had been told he was the only match in the world for a child in desperate need. He never hesitated. He didn't ask who the family was, where they were from, or what they did. He only asked when and where he needed to be. He insisted on complete anonymity, Mr. Saito explained, his voice laced with a reverence that seemed completely at odds with the man's reputation. It is the policy of the registry, but he was adamant. He refused any offer of compensation. He said it was not something that should be paid for. He took time off from his job, telling you, I believe, that he was attending a work conference. Alani's mind flashed back.
She remembered that week.
David had been tired when he returned, more so than usual, but he had been filled with a quiet, peaceful satisfaction. He'd said the conference was fulfilling. The memory, once mundane, was now recast in a sacred light. He flew to a hospital in Switzerland. He underwent the procedure. It is not a pleasant process. It is painful, but he did it. And he saved my son's life, Mr. Saito stated, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of an immeasurable debt. He gave me back my world. A man of my means believes he can acquire anything, solve any problem with money and power. But your husband gave me a gift that is beyond price. He showed me a kind of honor my world does not recognize. After the successful transplant, Mr. Saito had tried to find him. He had pulled every string, used every resource at his disposal, not to threaten or intimidate, but simply to say thank you. The registry held firm. But Mr. Sato's reach was long. It took him years, but he finally identified the anonymous hero. He found David. I wanted to thank him, to understand the man who would do such a thing for a complete stranger. I had this photograph acquired by my investigators. I kept it here as a reminder of true strength, of selfless virtue. His voice grew heavy. By the time I found him, it was too late. I learned the accident. I learned that he was gone. A profound, aching tenderness filled Alani's chest, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. This was the missing piece of her husband, a secret chamber of his heart he had kept to himself, not out of deceit, but out of a deep and abiding humility. He hadn't wanted praise or reward. The act itself was the point. Mr. Saito continued, his gaze fixed on the photograph of the smiling man on his wall. When I learned of his passing, I also learned of your circumstances, of the financial difficulties you were facing. It felt unacceptable. A profound dishonor to his memory that the woman he loved should suffer. He turned back to Alani, his expression stripped of all its former coldness, leaving only a raw, vulnerable sincerity. I could not simply give you money. It would have felt like a transaction, and his gift was not a transaction. It would have cheapened the purity of his action. And I suspect a woman loved by such a man would have too much pride to accept charity. He was right. She would have refused it, seen it as a handout. So he had devised a different plan. He had contacted the high-end cleaning agency, creating a lucrative, single-client contract with one condition, that they hire a specific applicant. Alani, I created this position for you, he said quietly. I made sure the salary was more than sufficient to solve your problems. I wanted to provide for you, to repay a fraction of my debt to him, in a way that preserved your dignity. I instructed my staff not to. He was a silent, grateful guardian, watching from a distance. He had been protecting the legacy of the man who had protected his own. I am not the man you think I am, Alani, he said, using her first name for the first time. Or perhaps I am. But your husband reminded me that there is another way to be. His goodness was a force more powerful than any weapon I possess. Please let me help you now. Openly.
Pay off the debts.
Fund your education. Whatever you need. It is not charity. It is my duty. It is my honor. The scent of bleach and ammonia had long since faded from her hands, replaced by the clean, antiseptic smell of hospital soap. 2 years had passed, 2 years in which the world had slowly, painstakingly, reassembled itself around a new center of gravity. Alani stood on the manicured lawn of the university, a black graduation gown flowing around her, a diploma clutched in her hand. She had done it. She was a registered nurse. It was a dream she and David had nurtured together, a plan for their future that had been shattered and was now, miraculously, whole again. She scanned the crowd of smiling families and cheering friends, and her eyes landed on a solitary figure standing near the back, under the shade of an old oak tree. Mr. Saito stood with his hands clasped behind his back, wearing one of his familiar dark suits. He was not smiling, but his eyes, when they met hers across the expanse, held a look of quiet, profound respect. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of shared understanding that spoke volumes more than words. Their relationship was an unusual one, forged in the crucible of grief and bound by a debt of honor. He had become a quiet, steadfast presence in her life, a benefactor who never once made her feel like a charity case. He had paid off every last cent of her and David's debt with a quiet efficiency that brooked no argument. When she told him of her dream to go into nursing, the funding for her entire education appeared in a trust account the next day. They met for tea once a month in a quiet corner of a downtown hotel, never at the mansion. They spoke of her studies, of his son, Hiro, who was now a healthy, thriving teenager. And sometimes they spoke of David. He was the ghost who sat at their table, the silent, benevolent force that had brought their two disparate worlds crashing together in the most unexpected and beautiful way. Alani was no longer invisible. She was seen, she was valued, and she was finally, blessedly free. The last stop on her graduation day was the cemetery. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass as she knelt before the simple granite headstone that read, David Carter, beloved husband. She carefully placed a bouquet of his favorite wildflowers at the base and then laid her nursing diploma beside them, protecting it from the damp earth with its leather folder. We did it, baby, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I finished. It was hard, but I thought about you. I thought about what you did. She traced the letters of his name with her fingertips. 4 months after his death, this place had been a monument to her pain, a raw, open wound. Now it felt different. It felt like a place of peace, of immense, quiet pride. She told him everything then, speaking to the silent stone as if he were sitting right beside her. She told him about Mr. Saito, about his son, about the anonymous, life-saving gift he had given. I don't know why you never told me, David, but I think I understand. It wasn't about the glory, was it? It was just about the doing, about helping someone who needed it. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above, and for a moment, it felt like an answer. She finally understood the full measure of the man she had married. His greatness wasn't in grand gestures, but in the profound, unseen kindness that had been the very fabric of his soul. Later that evening, back in her own small, comfortable apartment, an apartment she owned now, free and clear, she made tea. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was peaceful. On the wall above her small writing desk, in a simple silver frame, hung a photograph. It was the original from Mr. Sato's study. He had insisted she have it. It was David, leaning against that brick wall, the sunlight catching his face, his smile as wide and genuine as the day it was captured. His quiet act of goodness had not ended with him. It hadn't even ended with saving a young boy's life. It had rippled outward, touching and transforming her own life, lifting her from the depths of despair and setting her on a path of healing and purpose. She would now spend her life caring for others, a living continuation of his legacy. The final, lingering image was not of the mansion, or the diploma, or the grave. It was of the photograph, of David's smiling face, a timeless, silent testament to the simple, extraordinary truth that the richest life is the one given away in service to others.